For centuries, discrimination and segregation have plagued American society, denying millions of citizens their basic rights and freedoms solely based on the color of their skin. The civil rights movement was a monumental effort to confront this injustice head on, bringing about transformative social and legal changes that continue to shape the nation today. Discrimination refers to the unjust treatment of individuals or groups based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, religion, or gender. In the United States, racial discrimination has been a particularly pervasive and damaging form of prejudice, with roots tracing back to the era of slavery and the subsequent institutionalization of racism. One of the most insidious manifestations of racial discrimination was the system of segregation, which sought to enforce the separation of races in nearly every aspect of public life. This was codified through a series of laws and practices known as Jim Crow, which emerged in the late 19th century and persisted well into the 20th century, primarily in the southern states. Jim Crow laws mandated separate facilities for whites and blacks, ranging from schools and public transportation to parks, libraries, and even water fountains. This enforced separation was underpinned by the flawed doctrine of separate but equal, which was upheld by the Supreme Court's 1896 ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. In reality, however, the facilities and resources provided for African Americans were consistently inferior, perpetuating a profound sense of disenfranchisement and dehumanization. It wasn't until the landmark Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that the notion of separate but equal was definitively rejected as unconstitutional. This ruling paved the way for the dismantling of legalized segregation, but the road ahead was long and arduous, requiring sustained activism and immense sacrifices. The civil rights movement was a grassroots effort that spanned decades, galvanizing millions of Americans to stand up against the injustice of racial discrimination and segregation. At its core were courageous individuals who refused to accept the status quo, risking their lives and liberty to challenge the oppressive system that had denied them their basic human rights for far too long. Among the most iconic figures of the movement was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister whose powerful oratory and unwavering commitment to nonviolent civil disobedience inspired a generation. His leadership was instrumental in organizing pivotal events such as the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which began in 1955 when Rosa Parks, a seamstress, refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus to a white passenger. The boycott, which lasted over a year, was a resounding success, leading to the desegregation of public transportation in Montgomery. This victory fueled the movement's momentum, paving the way for other groundbreaking demonstrations, such as the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, calling for racial equality and an end to discrimination. The civil rights movement also witnessed the rise of other influential leaders such as Malcolm X, who advocated for black empowerment and self-determination through more militant means. While his approach differed from that of King, Malcolm X's fiery rhetoric and uncompromising stance against racism resonated with many disillusioned African Americans, particularly in urban areas. The sustained efforts of the civil rights movement yielded significant legislative achievements, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, employment, and federally funded programs. The following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, ensuring the protection of voting rights for African Americans and other minority groups, dismantling many of the discriminatory tactics that had long suppressed their political representation. While the civil rights movement succeeded in dismantling the legal foundations of segregation and discrimination, the battle for true equality and social justice is an ongoing one. Affirmative action policies aimed at promoting equal access and opportunities for historically disadvantaged groups, have been a source of ongoing debate and legal challenges. Proponents argue that affirmative action is a necessary corrective measure to address the lingering effects of systemic discrimination, while critics contend that it perpetuates reverse discrimination and undermines the principles of meritocracy. The Supreme Court has issued several rulings on affirmative action cases, attempting to strike a balance between promoting diversity and adhering to constitutional principles of equal protection. Another persistent issue is racial profiling, which refers to the practice of law enforcement officials targeting or treating individuals differently based solely on their race or ethnicity, often in the context of traffic stops, searches, and arrests. Racial profiling not only violates civil liberties, but also erodes trust between communities and law enforcement agencies, hindering effective policing and community relations. Efforts to address racial profiling have included policy reforms, data collection, and training initiatives, but progress has been uneven, with many communities, particularly those of color, continuing to experience the harmful effects of this discriminatory practice. Despite the significant strides made by the civil rights movement, ongoing disparities and injustices persist in areas such as education, employment, housing, and the criminal justice system. Movements like Black Lives Matter have drawn renewed attention to issues of police brutality, mass incarceration, and systemic racism, reigniting calls for comprehensive reform and a reckoning with the nation's legacy of racial inequality. As the struggle for civil rights continues, it is incumbent upon all citizens to recognize the enduring impact of discrimination and segregation, to confront and dismantle remaining barriers to equality, and to uphold the principles of justice and human dignity that lie at the heart of the American ideals.